Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It is Thursday, March 5th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with political correspondent Sam Sokol and reporter Charlie Summers, joining us for the first time for the Daily Briefing. Hey, Charlie. Hey, Sam.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here.
Morning. Good to be together amidst all of what is going on in our world over here in this corner. So just to give some headlines of the last few hours, after another night and early morning of both Hezbollah and Iranian missile and drone attacks, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, reiterated its warning to Lebanese civilians in southern Lebanon to evacuate their homes amid fighting against Hezbollah. The first repatriation flights for Israelis stranded abroad amid the war with Iran landed at Ben Gurion Airport early this morning. There are others set to arrive later in the day in order to help the estimated 100,000 Israelis unable to return home since Israel shuttered its airspace on Saturday. Today on the Daily Briefing, we're going to talk about what happened with the Iranian missile attack in Beit Shemesh, also some of the incidents that have taken place in Jerusalem, so stay with us. Okay, so we're going back to actually Sunday afternoon. It's Thursday now, but we haven't had a chance to look at this in depth. Looking at the missile impact in Beit Shemesh, it was the deadliest so far in this current conflict with Iran. During the 12-day war with Iran back in June, the deadliest attack was a missile striking a Bat Yam apartment building when 9 were killed. And the same number were killed on Sunday afternoon in Beit Shemesh. Sam, who lives in Beit Shemesh, was there within, I don't know, half an hour, an hour?
About 15, 20 minutes.
There you go. Sam, do us a favor and take us back to that moment. I know it's very difficult. Beit Shemesh is a place that you've lived for quite a while. It's your hometown. It's your neighborhood. And you were also our reporter on the scene at the time. Charlie joined you later on that day, or the next day. But Sam, take us through those first hours, please.
I was working on a story which obviously got delayed by several days because of this. But I got notifications. My phone lit up with WhatsApp notifications, videos of the rocket crashing, news about what happened. And I went to a neighbor and said, listen, there's no public transit now. Can you give me a ride? I was there in about 15 minutes.
Sam, hold on a second. Had you felt it? Had you gone into your own safe space when it happened?
Yeah, I had gone into a mamad, but
a safe room.
To safe room, exactly. But I didn't feel it. I didn't hear it. I was far enough away that I had no idea for about 2 minutes until, as I said, my phone just blew up. So I caught a ride to within a few blocks. The police had already set up a perimeter, went in, and it was just a scene of utter devastation. This was what had previously been a really quiet backwater residential street, nice houses, just
apartment buildings or mostly private homes?
Just private homes, very much sort of Leave It to Beaver suburbia, Israeli style. Yeah. And it had just been turned in a matter of seconds into pure hell. The streets were covered, completely carpeted with broken glass, twisted shards of metal. The main impact site, there was nothing left of the building, and
a crater. In other words, this was what I've heard.
Essentially, it was just turned into an empty lot full of rubble, and radiating out from there, in decreasing severity, was damage to the neighboring buildings. So the neighboring buildings were really hard hit, and as you got further out, you'll have roofs that are missing tiles, and it slowly petered out. But there were at least 10 structures there that were either destroyed or heavily damaged. And people were just wandering the streets in shock. I remember there was one girl in pajamas and flip-flops walking around with her phone holding a dog, looking like she was at one point. It was just pure chaos because you had rescue workers.
Right. I mean, what about ambulances and
rubberneckers. coming in to see what was going on. And I was just going up and speaking to people, and I found an old man standing in front of one of the damaged houses, hastily applied bandage on his arm, and the cuff of his shirt was starting to soak through with blood. And I went up to him and I started speaking to him, and he was saying that the rocket hit his house. And after just a very brief exchange, a few seconds, his daughter runs up. Dad, where's mom? He goes inside, in the mamad. She looks at me. Who are you? I go, I'm a reporter. Watch my father. So myself and a medic took this man and walked him a few feet over to a bus stop that was in front of the building. We sat him down. I was patting his shoulder, trying to calm him. Kept going, where's my wife? Where's my wife? She's inside. Someone get her. And after we managed to calm him a little, this kid, I don't know where he came from. I assume he was one of the neighbors, came up with a can of soda for the man. He started to calm down. And the medic, an elderly, ultra-Orthodox man with a long white beard, takes me aside and says, his wife's dead. We found bodies in the house. We just have to identify them and, bring someone from like the psychotrauma unit to break the news. And I'm standing there with this elderly man, knowing that his world has totally collapsed and knowing that he has no idea. It was just absolutely horrifying. And it really brought home the war. And I remember just a few days before telling my wife, I think Beit Shemesh is, a relatively safe place comparatively. We're not a huge target, but, that just goes to show you just don't know. Don't make any definitive statements in a war.
Right. Sam, this is of course all on the eve of Purim Eve, the day before the evening that Purim, the holiday of Purim started, which is of course is a huge event in Beit Shemesh, usually celebrated, in every way possible. Tell us about the next day. What was the next day like in the city, in the neighborhoods?
Well, even before we get to the next day, I'll say the day of the attack itself, at least in my neighborhood of Ramat Beit Shemesh, it didn't seem, aside from the fact that more stores than usual were closed because of home front command guidelines, people were going out doing pre-Purim shopping. Little kids were wandering by themselves, in costumes in the street where, a few neighborhoods over, people are dying, but, maybe 15, 20-minute drive away, across town, things were completely normal. And that was absolutely surreal. And the following day as well, people were preparing,
Let's just remind listeners that there were not allowed to be gatherings, any kinds of large gatherings. Now you did have, and we have a lot of coverage of this, in Tel Aviv, for instance, where a lot of people tend to go to bomb shelters during strikes. There were a lot of Purim parties, Scroll of Esther, Megillah readings that were taking place in shelters. Charlie, did you want to add something about that?
Also, our religions correspondent Rosella did an article, a sort of explainer article on the Purim guidelines for this year. During wartime, having public Megillah readings in bomb shelters is also like not allowed, even
though they had to be
it's seen as the safer option,
right? Exactly. So I just want to say, so Beit Shemesh, which has a very large ultra-Orthodox population who don't always follow guidelines, in the wake of this terrible tragedy, right? Take us through that a little bit. What were people doing or planning on?
Well, look, it definitely felt more subdued than usual, but there was still a lot of activity. I went to the liquor store near my house before Purim just to get a bottle of wine, and we had an azakah and
a siren.
We had a siren, air raid siren, and people were sheltering in the back of stores because people were still going out. People were still trying to live their lives the best they could within the the limitations imposed by the reality. But on Purim itself, it and Charlie can, I think, speak to this very well, is that people were, while some synagogues, including mine, were severely limited services or even canceled them, I went to Megillah reading in my own building by a neighbor,
Okay, in someone's apartment.
in someone's apartment. But there were synagogues that were open, and while things were much more subdued in the beginning hours, by the middle of the night, you had huge mobs of drunk teenagers wandering the streets.
Which is the norm for a regular Purim.
And during the day of Purim, things seemed not fully normal, but fairly close to normal.
Okay. Charlie, you went to Beit Shemesh. You live in Jerusalem. You went to Beit Shemesh to report on what Purim was like on this, just a night afterwards. Tell us what you found, what you saw.
So I will say the moment I got in maybe an hour and a half before sunset, and I got into Ramat Beit Shemesh, and I got off the bus and went up to a young Haredi, like ultra-Orthodox couple, and I asked them, are there any like Megillah readings going on at synagogue? And the guy looked at me like I was crazy. He said, "Are you kidding me? That's every shul is doing a Megillah reading, of course."
Like you can go anywhere and it's going to be happening.
Yes, exactly. And then I went up the road. A few minutes later, I got the Amber Alert sound on my phone saying that like sirens are anticipated. I should take shelter. And we didn't end up eventually hearing sirens, but I saw like a missile sort of flying through the sky and getting intercepted.
But people were just going about.
People were going about their
things.
day. I saw there were these two young ultra-Orthodox kids who went out on a ledge to look at and of course, there wasn't a siren, but if there was, I'm assuming they would still be on that ledge watching the missile. It's not like it would make much of a difference. And so virtually everywhere I went had Megillah readings going on. But I found, and I understand this changed over the course of the night and into the next day. I think Purim got off to a very slow start, I guess, in Beit Shemesh. There was, from the rabbis, I spoke to a rabbi and a rebbitzin.
Okay.
מה לעשות עכשיו?
All right, so we're going to pause. And we'll be back. We just leave and, okay. All right, let's go.
Let's speak of the devil.
So we actually haven't gone out to, that is just, by the way, the sound that we just heard is actually warning that there could be a siren. That is sort of this screechy sound, and now we're waiting to see if there will be the actual siren warning us to get into safe spaces. So for the moment, we're continuing with what Charlie was telling us about Monday night, right? We're on Monday night now after the strike in Beit Shemesh.
I spoke to people on the street, and people said, there are these Megillah readings that are going on every hour that the Chabad puts on. There's several different Chabads in Beit Shemesh. I went to two of them. So both Megillah readings that I went to, they were held like an hour separate from each other.
Okay. Where? In what kind of spaces?
One, they were both in shuls. They were in synagogues.
In synagogues.
So against the home front command guidelines, but still very, very sparse crowd. Normally, so when I was talking to the Chabad rabbi and rebbitzin, they actually they weren't obeying the home front command guidelines, but they were still shifting their usual sort of game plan to make it a little bit safer. So
Okay.
They held the Megillah reading in the synagogue rather than holding it outside in
Open
big
air.
public park, which they usually do.
Got it.
And they
And
said
was there a shelter or
it's
something
because
nearby?
it's close to like
Got
a safe room. So that's what they said to me. And they said that usually every single Megillah reading that they would have on like each hour would attract 100 people each. After the initial one, 100 people each. And when I was there were over a dozen people. People seemed very sort of depressed, but at the same time, the rebbitzin who I spoke to,
The rabbi's wife.
the rabbi's wife, was very insistent on remaining. Purim is it's supposed to be a very like happy, boisterous holiday where you go and you drink a ton and you read the Megillah and you celebrate the like
Destruction of of
the
Haman.
destruction of Haman, and sort of like the um the fact that the Jewish people weren't destroyed by this like advisor to the Persian king. So it's supposed to be a happy holiday, and so the Rebbitzin was very, very insistent on. She said, like, God commanded us to be happy, and we want to stay like sort of
In that spirit.
regardless of this like horrible tragedy that we've witnessed, regardless of the war.
So she referred to the tragedy
Yeah, she
of the
referred
day
to it.
before.
Well, I asked her about it.
Uh-huh.
And she referred to the tragedy. She said, despite this, we still need to remain happy. And she also there's I don't know whether people abroad are attuned to this at all, but there's this real feeling, I'm sure that they are, real feeling of like, what is happening now is like a replay of the Purim story.
Right, which
because
is something I think we've all had, we've either reported on it or we've felt it, that, Iran, Israel 2026 is essentially the modern day version of the Purim story.
I wouldn't be surprised if the government, in choosing a date, was willing to move it a little bit just to take advantage of the public perception. I'm not saying that I know this, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Sam, now that I have you back for the moment, talk to us a little. You and I spoke a little bit about the damage to houses that surround a bombing site, a strike site, and something that you discovered just in conversations as your reporting continued in Beit Shemesh.
So I haven't followed up on this and spoken to the people themselves, but I was speaking to a close friend who's a contractor who lives in my neighborhood.
A building contractor.
Yeah. He was telling me that, there were people up to 1 kilometer away who had broken windows, tiles falling off walls in lobbies. I mean, really, the damage.
Intense damage.
It's, there's a lot of knock-on effects in people who are dealing with, not death and destruction and loss, but, destruction, yes. They are dealing
You
with
can't be in a room
damage.
because the windows have all been blown in.
Yeah, so this, it has a wider circle of impact than we might think of just reading. And I think it's also important to keep in mind when thinking about the impact of these events that, we tend to think about, people are dead and people are wounded, but we don't think about the long-term suffering of the people who are wounded. Just because someone is wounded moderately or lightly doesn't mean that they're not walking with a limp for the rest of their life, or they're dealing with,
Their hands aren't working the way they used
exactly.
to. Yeah.
Or even, let's not discount the psychological trauma. So, this is, an event that might take a few seconds on the ground, and then there's a lifetime of consequences.
People are evacuated also there. I think the Beit Shemesh families were evacuated.
Yes, they were.
To Jerusalem.
One of the first things
Hotels.
that the city did
Yeah.
was set up a tent towards the end of the street with workers who were helping the families to first of all find,
What do you pack? How do you
yeah,
get yourself
exactly.
out of here?
Exactly. And sort of just following up on something that Charlie said in terms of the celebrating, normally on Purim, you would have not just big boisterous celebrations outside and big gatherings in synagogues, but you have the festive meal, the Seudat Purim, and usually people have large numbers of guests. And
it goes on for many hours.
And it goes on for many hours. And I stopped by a friend on Purim afternoon. He had been planning this huge party. There were like 3 or 4 people there because people were, at least some people were trying to stay at home, and we'll celebrate at home ourselves. So, it's a situation in which, people are responding in very different ways. Some people are going out in the streets and throwing raves. Some
No matter
people
what.
are staying home as close to a shelter as possible.
I do want to say about Beit Shemesh
Right.
that the people that I saw, I walked a lot that night
I'm
around
sure.
Beit Shemesh, because also the buses were sort of not running. You can
It's
figure
what
out
happens
what time
in a situation like that.
Yes,
You're just kind of
exactly.
walking and seeing and talking.
And so the people that I saw, it wasn't families like the people that I saw walking around were mainly young people,
Teenagers.
drunk, sort of troublemakers in small clusters. Like it wasn't usually on Purim you see yeah, people may be half drunk and people may be very like sort of partying, but it's not like small clusters. It's a huge group of people. Sort of
Right.
it turns like the outdoors sort of
Dozens.
turns into a
Yeah.
party. That wasn't the case here. It was a very select few people. I understand that changed.
Beit Shemesh is one of those places where you never really expect these things to happen because it's not particularly, there are targets nearby. There are things that people would target, but it's not really important central city. It's a bedroom community, and it's not somewhere where you really expect that, which just adds to the shock.
Randomness and the
Yeah.
shock of it.
Center was very, very. I'm not sure how it usually is during Purim, but the city center was dead. Like there was nobody out on the streets.
I think generally speaking, and I don't really like to generalize, but I think people who are more traditional or secular are more likely to adhere to the home front commands than the ultra-Orthodox community. So it's basically like two different cities with two different reactions.
Let's sort of stop on the Beit Shemesh topic, take a break, and when we're back, we're going to talk a little bit about the politics of the moment. Just to Sam to give us a little update, and then Charlie's going to tell us about Purim in Jerusalem and what he found and saw in his reporting. So stay with us. Okay, Sam, normally you are covering the Knesset very closely, and we turned to some other things, obviously, today, but a little bit of a couple of sentences, a minute or two about where we are, where you see things politically right now. What are you hearing?
Well, before the war started, we were in a very frenetic political period. The deadline to pass the 2026 budget is the end of March. And if it doesn't pass, the government automatically falls and new elections are held in advance of the scheduled date in the end of the year.
October, right?
Late October, yes. But so there was this big fight over the budget. There was this big fight over ultra-Orthodox enlistment. And all of these critical political issues sort of paused. Everything sort of paused.
Like you can't imagine that they could, and yet they did.
Exactly. And immediately after the war, the Knesset basically canceled all, all scheduled political activity, all parliamentary activity, I should say.
All committee meetings.
Except for a meeting on Monday of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, which was actually interrupted by a siren.
And was online or was in person?
No, it was in person. The members actually went to another committee room, which was Mimugan, which was like
safe room.
reinforced.
Reinforced room.
They actually put out a selfie of the opposition
Oh,
and
I
coalition
saw that
lawmakers.
you posted that, right.
But what's happened since then is the Knesset announced yesterday that limited parliamentary activity is going to resume. What that means is necessary meetings of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, which provides oversight. You're going to have budget-related discussions and anything related to necessary wartime legislation. So something that directly deals with things that need to be done for
Dealt
the
with
war
right
effort.
now.
Aside from that, though, things are really on a slow burn politically, at least in terms of formal parliamentary activity. One thing that I found interesting is I spoke to two veteran pollsters and a very knowledgeable coalition insider who were all very firm in saying that, it's very much too early to assume that Netanyahu will get any sort of political advantage from the war. It will be good for him, leaving aside the fact that we don't know how well we're going to do or not do. The truth is that after the last war with Iran last summer, Netanyahu barely got a boost in the polls, and what the short-lived boost that he did get was at the expense of his coalition partners in his bloc. So not something that would noticeably change the needle. The coalition insider I spoke with basically said Netanyahu doesn't believe that moving up the elections and calling early elections to capitalize on the war would be a good idea. One, because he wouldn't get enough of a bump, and two, because it would look cynical and political, which would actually harm him. The source that I spoke to said that what it looks like is that Netanyahu feels that a victory in this war plus a diplomatic victory afterwards could be enough to give him an advantage. So, for instance, if we win this war and then for whatever value of win,
Yeah,
depending
yeah,
on which
right,
goals.
exactly.
But let's say we have something that could be recognized as a win coming out of this war, and then another country joins the Abraham Accords. If he can add a diplomatic victory on top of a military victory, then that could be something that would help him. But the war itself, I would be very careful in believing any punditry saying it's going to hurt him, it's going to help him.
Thanks, Sam. Charlie, let's talk about Purim in Jerusalem. Coming back to the subject of the holiday that we just finished in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, a walled city, Purim is celebrated a day later than it is in the rest of the country. So Tzfat and Jerusalem, the two ancient walled cities in the country, celebrated it on Tuesday night, Wednesday. And you and I were in touch last night talking about this podcast, and you said, I got to run. There's a Purim rave going on in downtown Jerusalem. And clearly you wanted to go cover that because there were not supposed to be outdoor parties of any kind. So tell us what you were covering yesterday and what you saw there.
So I heard about this Purim rave relatively late in the game. It was already, I came after sundown.
When the
And-
holiday was officially over.
Yeah,
by
when
that
the holiday
point.
was officially over.
Right.
It's Motzei Purim, like it's
Right.
supposed to be
Post-Purim.
when the holidays ended. I got there, and it's Nachlot, this sort of like it's
Funky,
eclectic
candles and sandals, eclectic. Next to
neighborhood.
the Machane Yehuda market.
Hipsters meet hippies.
There you
Yes,
go.
we're-
Religious hipsters as
People
well.
are very into Jewish spirituality there.
Right.
But there were people from all over, not just in Jerusalem too.
Yeah.
And when
So they
I
came
spoke
to extend the Purim holiday in Jerusalem.
Yes, exactly. And when I spoke to people there, I realized, oh, this has been going on since noon.
All day party.
All day party.
Outside.
And police, from what I understand, came as Purim sort of was ending.
Meaning to
officially.
say, let's close this up, guys.
Yeah, but they sort of turned a blind eye, from what I understand, for in the hours prior.
How many people are we talking about? Is this in the streets? Is it in a park?
A street.
Like one of the internal little tiny streets of Nachlaot?
No, it was actually a street that cars drive on, Nisim Bachal Street.
Oh.
Near the end, there were cars that were trying to get in. But basically, police came. It was hundreds of people when I was there.
Dressed up, drunk.
Very, very drunk. All dressed up. There were a lot of people dressed as Trump. There was one guy who I saw who was holding a sort of fake
Like a
plaster
missile, right? Yeah.
You're fired. Direction: Tehran.
In English.
Yeah, in English. And then there was another Trump who I spoke to who said
Trump.
very harsh things about the Home Front Command. When I asked him, I went around basically asking people, like, what do you have to say to the people who want
you not to be
you
gathering
not
in
to
the
be
street?
gathering in the street? Screw Pico the Olive. He said
In
more
Hebrew.
in harsher terms than that in English to me. There was somebody who I spoke to in Hebrew, an 18-year-old from Bnei Brak, who told me
An ultra-Orthodox outlet of Tel Aviv.
Yes.
Okay.
who was dressed as like a sort of Rastafari guy. And I asked him, like, are you not afraid about like what could happen if a missile fell in? He said, whoever is destined to die will die.
18
and
years old.
A
God,
bit fatalistic.
Yeah.
very, very fatalistic. And he said, he actually brought up Beit Shemesh. He said, the shelters don't protect us. We saw in Beit Shemesh, because what happened was there was a missile that landed on a synagogue, and underneath was this public shelter.
Right.
However, even though public shelters aren't built to withstand these
Direct.
enormous ballistic missiles,
Yes.
the direct hits, they protect people from the shockwave, which is often deadly. Like the force of the shockwave of the missile can kill.
I think it's important to note, so I'm sorry to interrupt you, that when you've had people die in shelters, often it's when someone's near the door and it's open, or they're trying to close the door, and the people deeper in the shelter survive. When you have a shelter and the door is closed, your chances of survival go up significantly. So I just think it's important that our listeners understand that.
Yeah. So what he was saying was false, obviously. and misguided. But there was this sort of fatalistic, there was this defiance against police, against the home front command that sort of everybody was like evincing in that moment.
And what were the police doing or not doing?
So there were at its height, there were around 12 police. They were all blue clothes police. Meaning they were not part of the border police, which is a branch of the police, more militarized. It's similar to the IDF. They use conscripts, and they're oftentimes in Jerusalem deployed as a sort of a riot police
at protests.
At protests mainly, but also at just big events in general. You see them all the time in the Old City. It's mainly the border police who are operating in East Jerusalem, and the border police have been certainly in the Old City recently, because it's been more or less closed down. Shops aren't allowed to open.
It's also Ramadan.
And this is during Ramadan. The gates to Al-Aqsa on the Temple Mount are closed. And during the first few days of the war, we saw that in Damascus Gate, there were like crowd control barriers that were put up. And this is like one of the main gathering places for Palestinians, Jerusalemites, especially on Ramadan. And
so the contrast, really.
Yeah, so there's a major discrepancy basically in how police are dealing with these like large crowds on Purim versus how they're dealing with large crowds on Ramadan.
During this war with Iran.
During specifically the war with Iran. And so there were no border police, which was a surprise to me because it was hundreds of people. It was a huge crowd on the streets.
Right.
People were sometimes... cars that were trying to pass, they ended up being able to pass near the end. They were banging on cars, generally just like unruly behavior from drunk teenagers and 20-somethings. And so I was surprised that there were no border police, because usually in a situation like this you'd have them, but the police were completely outnumbered. Basically they tried to disperse it at one point by taking a police patrol car, blaring the sirens and moving it slowly through the crowd. But then they just came back onto the street afterwards. They didn't make any arrests at this specific rave. Later on, police put out a notification. They put out a statement saying they had dispersed the protest, which isn't really true. They took a loudspeaker. They seized a loudspeaker, which sort of killed the vibe. But they didn't really disperse it. They didn't disperse in the way that they usually disperse a protest.
Yeah, it's beyond just the people who are in the streets. You're discussing this discrepancy. I was following on Twitter the various reporters on it.
Yes.
How you wish. But I was following online the posts by reporters who cover the ultra-Orthodox beat. The ultra-Orthodox have long been a motif of my own reporting. And one thing that I kept seeing was images of mass gatherings in ultra-Orthodox synagogues, including some of the mega synegogues in Jerusalem.
Oh, I
you
saw
had
those too.
hundreds, if
Yes.
not thousands, of
Yes.
people
On this
gathering
Purim
in one
now.
building,
Mhm.
and there was no real enforcement of the home front command regulations on them. Forget a few hundred people partying in the street. Think several thousand people crammed into one building.
And which if there were a siren sounding, there's nowhere that they could really go.
No.
Right.
And we know that police also don't really... There's a lot of sensitivity among ultra-Orthodox Jews about police whenever they go into an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. And police are averse oftentimes to operating in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods.
Oh, yes.
Right. I think you both covered that, and I think we will come back to that in another podcast. I want one last thing from you, Charlie, and that is that you were out on Sunday night. Sorry, there was a missile attack in Jerusalem. A missile fell on a major road in Jerusalem on Sunday night. It was later in the evening, if I remember correctly. Right. And you went out to cover that, and no one was killed. They were injured from that attack. Just give us a little bit of a brief look at that, and then we'll close up for the day.
So thank God no one was killed. I had been in my apartment at the time. I was preparing to go to sleep, and got the siren, went into a bomb shelter, and there were very loud booms that time. That I heard, yeah. And I went out, checked my phone, and I saw that there was a direct hit in Jerusalem. And through Telegram, through this like messaging app, I was able to find out. The police won't tell you where it is because of the military censor. So I was able to find out that it was at like on sort of this highway north of Jerusalem.
Near Ramot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was the entrance to Ramat Shlomo. And so I took a taxi to the place. Police had closed off the highway, and so he dropped me off. I ran to the scene. And because it was on a highway, there weren't eyewitnesses. And so the people had already been, taken to the hospital. There was one person who was moderately injured, which is, as you said, pretty usually moderate injuries. That just means that they're not life-threatening.
die, yeah.
Like, they're not going to die, but it's still
Right.
can still
Still
change
a
their life.
huge issue. Yeah.
And there was a crater that was taking up 2 lanes of the highway. You could see there were some burnt out cars, and there were tons and tons of police and firefighters operating in the area. There were police, like bomb disposal experts, who were going into the crater and sort of checking for extra munitions, whether there was something that hadn't exploded yet. And there were bulldozers that were trying to basically fill it, that eventually came and tried to start filling it back up and taking the rubble off of the street. But aside from that, thank God, it was a very uninteresting.
And this week that we've had,
Yeah.
this week of holiday and celebration has been, I think, very different. Certainly, really, probably everywhere.
I mean, in Jerusalem, it was like you had everybody. You had like Avnei Netanyahu, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's younger son was also at this Purim rave. Like, you really truly had. He was like flanked by 2 security guards, and that was like a video that made the rounds on Hebrew Twitter. Sadly, I didn't get to see him, but yeah, no, it was very. I did not expect that police would let it go on for so long.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're going to call this podcast, this daily briefing today. It's been extremely enlightening to have both of you with us to tell us what you've been reporting on, what you've been seeing. So thank you, Sam, and thank you, Charlie, for being with me today. Thanks for stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode is produced by Ari Schlacht. As always, stay in touch. Feel free to send us comments at podcast@timesvisual.com. Until next time, take care, be well, stay safe, and see you soon.